Thank you all again for joining us. I'm excited to be with you today for our second session of Among Friends, our virtual alumni speaker series. My hope is that this series will provide informative and interactive digital sessions that showcase the knowledge and talents of our alumni. For those of you who joining us who don't know me, I'm Christine Pappas, Friends School Class of 2001, and the Director of Alumni Relations and Engagement here at Friends. I'm delighted to introduce today's guests, Dr. Catherine Mclean, who we know as Kit, Class of 2002, and Dr. Anita Gadia Smith, Class of 1980. A little about their professional backgrounds. Dr. Mclean, who is just a year behind me while we were at Friends, is a clinical psychologist and founder of Dynamic Psychotherapy, a private practice in Washington, D.C. She completed her undergraduate studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and received her doctorate of psychology from the George Washington University. After graduate school, Dr. Mclean moved back to Baltimore for 2 years to complete a postdoctoral fellowship at Sheppard Pratt, where she worked on the Trauma Disorders Unit. She's currently in her 4th year of psychoanalytic training at the Washington-Baltimore Center for Psychoanalysis and has presented her clinical work at Johns Hopkins University, the Baltimore Museum of Art, and the Psychiatric Institute of Washington. Thanks for being here, Kit.
Thank you for having me.
Next is Dr. Anita Gadia Smith, Class of 1980, a psychotherapist, best-selling author, and expert contributor on mental health reporting and federal legislation. Through her private practice offices in Bethesda, Maryland, and Washington, D.C., she treats adults and adolescents suffering with substance abuse and addictions, relationship and family issues, and a host of related disorders. Dr. Gadia Smith received her undergraduate degree from Johns Hopkins University, an MSW from the Catholic University of America, and a doctorate of psychology from Southern California University. And 2 of her most recent professional awards include the 2020 Best in Washington, D.C. Psychotherapist and the 2020 Friends School Distinguished Alumni Award last year. So welcome, Kit and Anita.
Thank you very much for having us.
We're so delighted that you both are here. Before we begin our conversation today, I just want to do some quick virtual protocols. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Kit and Anita will answer them during our Q&A session towards the second half of the session. And of course, the usual virtual event disclaimer. We've done everything that we can to prepare and make this event a success, but we're at the mercy of technology and we are live. So if our Wi-Fi misbehaves, please be patient and we'll work to get back on. And in the event that we get cut off completely and we're unable to resume the event for some reason, I'll send an email to everyone. So let's get started. So let's talk a little bit about the 2 of you first. We'd love to hear a little bit more about you both professionally. Anita, let's start with you. Can you tell us about your what drew you to the field of psychology and your particular areas of specialty?
I would say I was drawn to the field of psychology from the age of 5. I was always interested. I grew up around a lot of craziness, and I think I wanted to try to understand it and figure it out. I was a lifer at Friends School 14 years. And after graduating in 1980, I went out into the world and, took a break for a while and then went back to graduate school about 10 years later and just went through a lot of challenges with my health and my life. And I went through an alcoholism and addiction problem, actually while I was at Friends, and then until 1990 when I got sober and got into recovery. And then after I got into recovery, I decided to go back to graduate school again and get into this field and not only work with addiction and recovery issues, but also other mental health issues and relationships and families. And along the way. It's been a lot of fun with writing books, and I've also done a lot of work with the media, television and other print media. I currently do a weekly column for young people who are dating, which is always interesting and brings back a lot of memories. But I have just loved this field, and just having meaning and purpose in life, and being able to contribute, which was, one of the things that Friends School gave me, was that desire to uh, try to be a good human being, and be a force for good.
Wonderful. Thank you. Kit, what about you?
Well, I also had a bit of a winding road. After leaving Friends School, I went to college, and then after college worked in politics for several years, and then moved up to New York City and worked in film, and was sort of unsatisfied with sort of the lifestyle, and including the number of hours I was working, and realized what I was really interested in was people's stories. But I do think a lot of my interest in people's stories and people's sort of individual histories does come from my experience at Friends. And one of the things that I so appreciated about going to Friends School was that whole sort of philosophy of that of God in everyone. In other words, I had friends that went to a lot of the neighboring private schools, and I always had this sense that there was sort of a mold that they were trying to create. And at Friends, I really loved the fact that I think people that the school and the culture sort of embraced the individual and thought, just be who you are, but be that to the fullest. And I've certainly carried that with me into my practice.
Thank you. So today's discussion topic is coping with our new normal. There's a lot going on in our lives with the pandemic, and this week with the election, and just navigating what's now a more virtual world in general. We're 8 or 9, almost 9 months into this new normal, and I don't think anyone is, everyone knows that we're all experiencing some difficulty. So let's talk a little bit about some of the most significant issues that you all are seeing with your patients within your practices. Anita, let's start with you.
Well, what I've been seeing, to kind of sum it up, is an increase in anxiety, increase in depression, increase in substance abuse and drug addiction, and all of those related problems. And also, I work with not only individuals, but couples, but a lot of issues with couples. The pandemic has been a great unmasking force that has brought to the surface whatever was going on underneath the surface in people's lives. There's all the distractions have been removed. A lot of extraneous activities. We're now just focused on the essentials and doing what we need to do to live. And without all of those distractions, the things that were being hidden underneath the surface have all come to the forefront. So I've seen it with relationships and couples. Some couples have gotten closer and much happier because they have more time together and they really appreciate each other. And then some couples have gotten to their difficulties, and a lot more have been seeking help to deal with them. And some are divorcing. And so what I mostly see is that whatever was already there is magnified and, getting more attention than it used to. And I am seeing people, as far as addiction and recovery goes, I'm seeing people seeking help and getting sober. People are still going to treatment centers. People are still going to AA. In fact, many of the groups are bigger than ever because now everything is on Zoom, and it's so easy to access that a lot of people who could not go to 12-step meetings before, they can go much more easily with schedules and time constraints, and not having to drive and park that's always a big issue in this part of the world. And so we're seeing an interesting, you know, growth in recovery and a beautiful adaptation to a new way of living life. And what the way that we're living now is, you know, in the Friends tradition, very simple. And we're seeing people adapt every area of their lives to it, and also mental health treatment. In my own practice, I've still been seeing people in person, you know, with masks and social distancing, and then also working remotely as well. But it's been a busy time. I think that people are really serious about dealing with their lives now, and really focusing on what's important and what's essential.
Thank you. And what about you, Kit? What are you seeing in your practice?
Well, I'm seeing also increased anxiety. I already specialized in anxiety, so I was working with, you know, a patient population that already ran anxious. But certainly the pandemic, and then more recently the election has just increased that anxiety. But I'm also seeing more depression than I've ever seen before. I'm seeing a lot of hopelessness. I'm seeing a lot of people who I think just feel either lost or stuck. And, you know, one thing I keep hearing over and over again is how something about living through this pandemic feels sort of like Groundhog Day, or like people talk about, it feels like walking through molasses. There's just this kind of like a kind of slow slog. And so it's really hard, I think, to stay motivated, to stay focused, to be goal oriented, and to feel like you're on a path, and a path that you feel good about.
Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about what you're seeing, let's switch gears and talk a little bit about some ways that you've been recommending to your patients to deal with the depression, to deal with the anxiety, and the substance abuse that you're seeing. Anita, I think we were going to talk about a little bit about self-care.
Sure. Self-care is really the cornerstone of your life and each day. And the 4 things that I recommend to really work on are sleep, exercise, nutrition, and mental health care. And in terms of self-care, there's also the component of recognizing what it is we're consuming, whether it's food or media or television, and striving to create a new structure in the new world that we're in. Having structure, because many people are working at home. And what I recommend is to try to structure your day into 3 parts. The first part of the day is for self-care, the sleep, exercise, nutrition, mental health practices, spiritual practices, that sort of thing. Then the second section of the day is for work. And the third section of the day, or the end of the day, is for play. And so implementing structure is extremely important right now, with so many people working from home and not going anywhere. There aren't many places to go. The other thing that I think is helpful in terms of mental self-care is to focus on gratitude, to have an active practice of gratitude every day. A lot of people think about gratitude and they just wait for the feeling to come upon them when they feel good enough. But I look at that a little differently. I see gratitude as a decision and a choice, and that each day we can choose to focus on what we're grateful for. And there are many things to be grateful for that have come out of the pandemic. There's more downtime, more time to relax, more time to sleep, more time to focus on what really matters. Although we can't see everyone in person, we can talk on the phone, we can connect via computer, And we can actually have deeper conversations because we're not so busy running around all the time. And so we can still cultivate new relationships, and we can deepen the ones that we already have. One of the greatest dangers in this time is isolation. And so we really have to work on connecting and not allowing ourselves to get isolated. And that's one of the big components of self-care as well. I sometimes recommend try to reach out to 3 people a day. That's it's a concrete goal, something you can do. Doesn't have to be huge, but just try to connect and try to remember to do it every day. So those are just some thoughts, and it's a great question.
Kit, what about you? What are you recommending for folks?
Well, I would echo everything that Anita just said. I mean, I think self-care is so important, and it's a concept that can be elusive. So I think it's also really important to just think about like what works for you, because self-care can mean a lot of different things to different people. And I agree. I think gratitude is something that has to be cultivated. It's not something that you necessarily want to wait for it to kind of happen upon you, but it's something that I think the more you sort of make an effort to make time for that in your life, the more of it you have. And finally, I would also just echo, I think connection is so important. And I think one of the things that's really challenging is trying to kind of balance how much screen time we all have. And so for me personally, because I see so many of my patients on Zoom all day, I really value connecting with friends over the phone. I've used the phone so much more in the past, since March than I ever did in the sort of 10 years leading up to that. But I think, sort of talking with people over the phone, writing letters, sending cards or gifts. I mean, I think you can get creative. And I think creativity is also another important kind of avenue and outlet during this time.
Yeah.
Well, we've already got some questions coming in for both of you, and I want to make sure we're so lucky to have 2 very highly qualified therapists with us. So I want to make sure we get to folks' questions. But anything else that you want to add before we go into the question and answer section?
I think I'd like to add that this is also a time where we can access new strengths that we didn't know we had, and recognize how resilient we all are in terms of coping and adapting and getting through, and just how important it is to remember every day that this is temporary. We refer to it as a new normal, but it's a temporary normal. And this is not the end of the road for us in any way.
Thank you. Okay. So first question, as a teacher, I'm struggling with structuring the day. Schools know that you are home and therefore can call for Zoom meetings and barrage with emails on a consistent basis. How do I deal with that as an educator? I feel as if I'm working more hours than ever before from home, and there's always something left to do. The work is never finished. Kit, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. I mean, I think it's so hard. First of all, let me just say, for teachers, my heart just goes out to all of the teachers out there, because this is such a stressful thing. Not only do you have to balance sort of the stress of having to totally change your way of teaching and relating to students and families, but you also, I think, have to carry a lot of the student stressors about that. And this is a difficult time for students of all ages. But I do think some of this gets back to sort of screen time and being able to look away from the screen. It feels like so much of what we do is connected to a computer. And so what I really recommend is trying to kind of structure when you're sort of online, so to speak, and when you're offline, and having a sort of endpoint to that where you can just say, okay, I've done what I can for the day. I'm not going to check emails anymore. I'm not going to accept, any kind of Zoom calls or meetings anymore. And from that point forward, just sort of being offline. I also think it's helpful to get outdoors and to try to take walks or exercise. I think that's can be really helpful in terms of alleviating stress.
Anita, do you have anything that you want to add to that about a teacher trying to structure the day with all the emails and work?
Yeah, I have several patients right now who are teachers. I also have several who are students, and I also have a number of parents of students, and everyone is having an equally hard time. I would say that the teachers are having the hardest time. The parents are having the second hardest time, and the students next. Boundaries are the key to sanity in almost any area of life. And what that means is that you have to say no. Sometimes you have to, just because you can be available or just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be available. And there's a big difference between not wanting to help and not being able to be available. And so it's your responsibility to yourself and your choice to decide when you're available and when you're not, and to try to not have guilt about that. And it is a very stressful time, and a lot of people are pulling on helpers, and teachers are also helpers. And first and foremost, helpers, educators, therapists, we all, parents, we all have to take care of ourselves first and give from our bounty and not our reserve. So I would say to really focus on clarifying what your boundaries are, and really working with time management and scheduling so that your schedule serves you rather than the other way around.
I think we can all say we're a little guilty of that. It's hard to say no, especially when you love what you do. And I know many of our educators and teachers do. So, and like you said, they're helpers. So yes, thank you for that. The next question, interested to hear if you have thoughts around engaging clients online. I work with adolescents and find they are zoomed out and that it can be hard to have a regular and meaningful session.
So I don't do Zoom. My sessions are either on the phone or in person. We have found through trial and error that Zoom is too stressful and distracting, and that people really don't like to have to look at themselves. They then are worried about how they look, and it's a lot harder to concentrate. So I guess I'll defer to Kit because you're doing it that way. So.
Well, sure. I will. Here's the first thing I'll say is that when the pandemic started, I switched to doing all virtual sessions, which meant basically doing, I use Simple Practice, but it's more or less like Zoom. And I felt so burnt out at the end of the day. And I also felt the same thing, which is that especially with a lot of the younger patients that I work with, I don't work with adolescents, but I work with college students and a lot of young adults. I did feel like they were sort of zoomed out, and also they were relating to me in a very different way. They were relating to me more like, I think, the way they would relate to friends on FaceTime, which was interesting to see. I sort of, I learned more that from sort of switching to that, but there was definitely a kind of major burnout. And sometimes I felt that they were very distracted. As the pandemic has gone on, I've given all of my patients the option of trying phone sessions. And now I would say close to half of them, if not a little bit more, have opted to switch to phone sessions. What I will say is that I've noticed that there's there's people who are basically 30 and older. Almost all of them have switched to phone at this point. People who are 18 to 25 still tend to prefer Zoom. I think that they just don't feel comfortable talking on the phone because they're really part of a generation that hasn't sort of learned how to do that. But what I have done is I've started to integrate other tools into some of those sessions. So for certainly if I worked with adolescents, I think using like tools from art therapy, for example, could be really, really helpful. Sometimes doing more of changing the format around might be helpful. I do think you have to be a little bit more engaged and active as a therapist over Zoom, which is hard because sometimes I think you don't want to control the session too much. You want to let it evolve naturally. So it's a hard thing, but I can highly recommend sort of if you have any friends who are art therapists, reaching out to them and asking them for some suggestions, because I think that that's a good way to mix things up and kind of get creative.
Kit, that's very interesting that you've had a lot of people switch to phone. Even before the pandemic, I had about a third of my patients were already working by phone because they prefer it. And they wanted to do that even before the pandemic. Maybe it has something to do with DC traffic and all of that, because it really is quite an ordeal getting around in this town. But that it's great to have so many options and to be able to carry on. So that's great.
And as for this next question, I could have written it, though I did not. A member of the class of 2004 did, but I'm very curious to hear both of your responses. I've been struggling a lot during this time. I'm teleworking, barely concentrating, husband on unemployment, daughter in virtual kindergarten. You've talked a lot about self-care and downtime. How do you recommend parents of young children getting that time in? It feels like as parents, we have no time to ourselves or as a couple. And let's be real, kids can drive you crazy.
Well, my heart goes out to you. That is such a hard position to be in with young kids and trying to work and the stress of unemployment and kind of balancing finances. I think the most important thing is to be able to ask for help when you need it and to really call on your support system. I think for you, you're sort of stuck with a young child all day long, but for other people, being around a young child could be refreshing and can bring them so much joy during this pandemic. So I think this is the time to kind of lean on parents and relatives and friends who don't have kids and ask them to come over and take the kids out for a walk or to read the kids stories and to sort of try to make time for you and your husband to play yourself, so that not all of the play, as Anita sort of mentioned, has to do with parenting.
Anita, anything you want to add there?
Well, I think again, boundaries, that to the extent that you're able to set them, you're in. I have a lot of empathy for your situation here, and it is very hard to find time when you really do have to be on 24 hours a day. But to the degree that you can create fun and play within the time that you have, just to focus on balance and moderation and variety in everything that you're doing during the course of your day.
And we'll just take 2 more questions. For people who might be interested in or needing a therapist, how do you recommend they go about finding one? Kit, I'll let you take that one.
Sure. Yeah. So I obviously am a big believer in therapy, and I think that can be a really, really smart investment in yourself and in your life. And in terms of finding a therapist, the first thing I would say is that it is an investment. It's an investment of your time and of your money. And it's really important to find someone who's the right fit. And sometimes that can take a little time, but I think it's worth it to find someone that you really feel like you connect with and that you can be really honest with, and that you feel can help you and can understand you. So the first thing I always recommend is, if you know any therapists, reaching out to them. And of course, Anita and I both work in Washington, D.C., but I know I certainly have colleagues in Baltimore as well. And have colleagues really around the country who I can reach out to and ask for recommendations. And we have these different listservs, so they can say, like, looking for a therapist in Denver, Colorado, who has evening availability, for example. And usually we can get back a few names. So I hope people will feel free to reach out to me and in the future, and I'm sure Anita feels this way as well, if they need resources in Washington or Baltimore. Another great resource is the website Psychology Today, which allows you to go online and type in your zip code and a certain mile radius, and allows you to look up therapists in the region. And usually they'll have their website connected to that. And there's a little button that you can click to send them a message. And most therapists are willing to do a sort of 10 or 15-minute phone consultation for free. And that usually gives you some sense of their approach, and gives you, a sort of an immediate sense of whether you feel like you might connect with them. And finally, I think another good resource is your primary care physician or your pediatrician or your OBGYN. Most doctors have a list of therapists that they refer to. So depending on what you're struggling with, whether it's, parenting, or whether it's fertility issues, or whether it's work-life balance, I think all of those people are going to be great resources who can connect you with providers in the community.
Thank you. Anita, can you talk a little bit about some resources you recommend for those who might be specifically dealing with substance abuse?
Well, a good place to start is with a therapist who specializes in these types of issues. A lot of people do that as a first step before deciding on a program, an intensive outpatient or inpatient program. It's really a good way to begin. And in addition to all the online resources, you can always talk to your friends and get referrals from people. Word of mouth is a big big help, as well as all of the online resources. And I would add also that one of your best resources is your own gut feeling about someone, because therapy, it's all about the fit. And you go online and you see what people have done and maybe what they know or what they've studied. And that's all great, but it's not as important as who they are. And it doesn't take very long to get a sense of who someone is by just talking to them for a couple of minutes. Usually within the first couple of minutes, you get a feel for what someone is like and whether you want to keep talking to them or not. And if you do, keep going and explore it further.
Thank you both. Another question just came in. I know how important connection is for our teens. I'm finding that my teen is on social media in the middle of the night due to an inability to sleep due to anxiety. I don't want to take the phone away, but it's a very fine line. What can I say that would help my teen take a break from the phone? Kit, do you want to start with that? Just a little bit about anxiety.
This is a tough issue. This is a really tough issue. One of the things that that we have been seeing with teenagers and young adults is that the phone provides this automatic distraction for them, and it becomes a way of getting rid of their anxiety. But really, they're not really overcoming the anxiety. They're just switching their focus. So something that I think happens quite frequently is that someone feels some pang of anxiety, and quickly they pick up their phone and they look on Instagram or TikTok, and it's sort of this endless stream of distractions. Now, sometimes those distractions and looking at sort of comparing yourself to everyone else can actually increase an individual's anxiety. So that's always a concern. But I think the biggest concern is that because people have their phone in their hand at all times, it's like an extra limb that we have now. It's so easy to not learn how to tolerate anxiety. And so I think for a lot of young people, just they feel anxious for like a split second, and then here's this device that can kind of make it go away. And I think the key is to try to help them actually build a tolerance for some anxiety, that it's okay to feel a little anxious, a little panicked, that it's actually normal in some instances. You know, if you have a big assignment due the next day, or if you're going to be presenting in class, or if there's something going on in your friend group, it makes sense that you might feel some anxiety or discomfort, and that's okay. And I think it's really hard if it's in the middle of the night and this is sort of like their security blanket almost. But I think if you can help a teenager to practice sitting with anxiety, tolerating that anxiety during the day, then hopefully they can build up a better tolerance for that at night.
Anita, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. I was just thinking that even before the pandemic, kids and electronics were a huge issue. The, constant connection with the phone and the computer and the iPad. And for a lot of kids, also gaming has been a huge issue. I did an interview about gaming just yesterday with Canadian TV. And the thing about the electronics, whether it's a game or the social media, is there's an addictive component to it that is actually a biochemical component. With addictions, you have external substances that you can take, drugs and alcohol, from the outside that you put into your body. But with process addictions, like electronics addictions, gambling, shopping, sexual addictions, there's all kinds of process addictions. That addiction is also a drug addiction, but the drug comes from within yourself. So these are the endochemical addictions. And so as the person gets deeper into an addiction with electronics, it's a continuous dopamine drip. Every time you get a notification, there's a little hit of dopamine and then another hit of dopamine. And so it's very much, one of the pleasure chemicals. And now that kids are not able to see one another and go out and be normal and, and connect, that's all they have. So that's the only pleasure that they've got. And so you can't really take it away because they're using it for everything right now. But what you can do with kids is try to make sure that at least the time is balanced between different types of activities. That there's electronics time for learning, there's time for social, there's time for play. And if they can handle, some gaming, a lot of people can, then, they can have, but having balance and variety and moderation rather than having one thing take over to an extreme. But the whole addictive component of the electronics is a really important part. And it is biochemical. And just like all addictions, we develop a tolerance to it, and we need more and more as time goes on in order to get the same amount of pleasure. So, we'll see what happens after the world opens up again. But right now, it can't be eliminated. We can't have abstinence, but we can try to manage it.
Yeah, the other thing I would just add to that is that, I think you can talk to your teenager about sleep hygiene and good sleep hygiene. And everyone sort of knows it's not really the best to be looking at a blue screen before bedtime. That keeps you awake and makes it harder to fall asleep. And you could ask your teenager, how can I help you with this? You can say, like, I don't want to take your phone away and confiscate that. I want to treat you, I want to sort of collaborate on this, but if it would be helpful for me to take your phone, or if it would be helpful to leave your phone in the charger downstairs, then I'm on board with that. And that way, maybe it's more coming from them than from you.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take one more question. How do you differentiate, Kit, if you can talk a little bit about this, normal and healthy anxiety versus what you would consider clinical anxiety? Because with everyone's heightened anxiety at this point, I feel like it would be hard also to tell what's the difference.
Right. That is hard. I mean, before the pandemic, we would talk about hypochondrial anxiety and someone who is always scared of germs or getting sick. But then the pandemic hits and everyone is scared of that, as they sort of should be. So it's really hard to kind of differentiate between what would be a normal, healthy anxiety and what would be considered, again, more clinical, sort of generalized anxiety disorder. And the way I really differentiate between the two is, to what extent does it impair your ability to function? So to what extent is the anxiety debilitating? And I do think a good way to think about that is to think of three realms: work, love, meaning relationships, and play. You know, if the anxiety is getting in the way of your work performance or your school performance, and it's also getting in the way of your ability to have meaningful and sort of long-lasting relationships, and it's also getting in the way of being able to be playful and spontaneous and have hobbies that you enjoy, then it's probably a problem. And it would be a good idea, I think, at that point to seek out a therapist and potentially to even seek out a psychiatrist and consider medication in sort of extreme cases. But if it's anxiety about, you know, if it's that you find yourself refreshing the New York Times just to see sort of the election update, or anxiety about when will this pandemic be over, it's not to say that you couldn't benefit from talking to someone or that therapy might not be helpful, but I think it's that seems more part of our new normal, and learning how to tolerate that.
So we're going to close this session. Thank you both so much for being here. Before I let everyone go, though, I wanted to see if Anita or Kit, you had any other thoughts to end us with. Anita, I'll start with you.
Well, I'd like to just give my contact information in case anyone who's here would like to reach me. My website is practicaltherapy.net. That's practicaltherapy.net. And my office phone number is 202-714-0000, 714-0000, area code 202. And I have offices in Bethesda, Maryland, as well as Georgetown in the district. And thank you so very much for having me. I love Friends School, and it's such an honor to be here with you and fellow friends.
Thank you so much, Anita. Kit, anything else you'd like to add? And I will also tell the audience that we will be sharing, I can share the information with anyone who requests it via email too after this session. Because everyone has on this call has my email, because I'm in people's inboxes a lot.
So the best way to contact me is just to go to my website, which is drkitmclean.com. But also you can get in touch with Christine, and she can pass along my contact information. And I will also just second how much I love Friends School, how nice it is to connect with Friends School alums and teachers and parents, and just thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm so happy that so many people have joined today.
Well, the pleasure is ours, and thank you so much to you both, and enjoy your weekend. Thanks to all of our audience who came, and hopefully we'll see some of you at the next session. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye.